welcome to Writer, a program about and for writers. And my name is John Garman, and today my guest is Carla Hartsfield, a Canadian poet and classical pianist. And I think that we're going to enjoy talking with Carla. Carla, welcome, and
thank you, John.
Very happy to have you on the program today. I'm kind of interested in, first of all, in knowing some of your background. What led you to become a poet and a musician? Could you give me maybe a little bit of an idea of that?
Okay. Well, I started to play the piano very early, and that's not that unusual. Often children will show interest in music, but the language comes much further after. So I began to play the piano by ear when I was 3, started lessons at 4, and it was pretty much took over my life. I was doing a lot of competitions early on, winning and playing concerts, and I made my first recording when I was 14 and went on tour to Israel and Greece. That was very exciting. And it was pretty much the decision that I would become a musician, and when I went to university, study music. And around the age of 20, I started to feel as though I didn't really have a good sense of my identity. Everything was sort of bound up in the music, and began to write poetry.
I understand you also teach at the Royal Conservatory of Music in Toronto.
Yes.
Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, actually, that was a dream come true, because it wasn't really planned that I would go to Canada. That was something that happened after graduate school. I wanted to study with Anton Quirty as a Beethoven specialist. And of course, there's the famous graduate of the Royal Conservatory, Glenn Gould. And about a year after I went to Canada, I was working toward going to the International Bach Competition in Washington, and did some master classes with Quirty at the Festival of the Sound, and one thing led to another, and I was hired on at the conservatory. And in between, I met my husband too. I married a Canadian, so ended up staying there.
Yeah, I didn't say in opening that you're actually a native Texan.
That's right. Yeah.
You ended up in Canada, so you're an international poet and musician. How do you feel about your music as it supports or influences your poetry?
That's a really interesting question. I've been called a lyric poet. The lyric poetry is dependent on the rhythm in the line. It doesn't necessarily rhyme, although all of my first poems rhymed. If you were to look at them, you wouldn't see anything too much different from song lyrics. And in my first creative writing class that I took with Albert Goldbarth before going to Canada, I was strictly told, do not rhyme. You won't ever publish in a serious magazine if you continue to do this. So I had to lose that for a while anyway, that musical aspect, which came so naturally to me in the writing. And then I think the poetry, beyond the lyrics, the short lyrics I was writing, took on more of a narrative style. As I became more comfortable with my own voice, I got really into storytelling, and it became almost a document of personal history, things that had happened to me in my travels in performing, the people that I'd met, my family, which as Texans are sort of larger than life. They're all storytellers.
I happen to know that you have published several books, and you're quite well known as a poet in Canada and the U.S., and you've won several awards for your poetry. You've been in several anthologies.
Yes.
Do you have some poems that you like, some of your own poetry that you like better than the others, or some that you read? Or would you care to share any poetry with us today?
Sure, I would love to read some. I think because I also do work in the high schools in Toronto, a program called Learning Through the Arts, which is integrated arts learning. I find that the students also really respond to poems that tell stories. And in fact, when I first start to read these poems, they don't really think they're poetry because they don't have, the poetry that they're used to reading is much more archaic, or more like, or what they're writing is rhymed, is like a Hallmark card sort of thing. So that's a real revelation that they can put that much of themselves into their own writing. So I tend to read the ones that I think will have meaning for the people that I'm reading the poetry. But if you'd like for me to read
I'd
a
like
poem.
Give a sample here.
Okay. Well, this is from my first book, The Invisible Moon. And when I first moved to Canada from Texas, this was quite a revelation to me. To have winter 8 months out of the year. So the whole first section of this book is about the ice. And this one's called Now You See It, Now You Don't. The back window of the car has crystallized into 1,000 unstoppable equations. A mathematical problem solved when the coiled defroster is hot enough to dry it out of existence. Then again it snows and sun throbs through wet, six-sided geometric designs. The flakes, awkward in motion. My mother would always say the devil was beating his wife when sun rained through rain. But what does one say for snow? At home, snow was as rare as a friendly face here in winter. In crowds, they snap into smiles as toothy as carved pumpkins. I watch snowflakes flee the long whips of sun, afraid of touching.
That's great. You have a lot of imagery in that poem. Do you consciously think of images when you're writing your poetry?
Well, I think because this was the first book, there's maybe a real conscious effort.
Yeah.
In fact, that's something that I'm still told by editors to lose too many of the other. If you have too many images, then they crowd in the way of the meaning of the poem. But I think many poets are drawn to the image. That's one of the things that attracted me the most about writing poetry initially.
What do you do as far as revising your poetry? Do you do a lot of revisions, or do you start with a complete poem and then add to it and take away from it, or do you have any ritual that you engage in when you're working on trying to get to that final product that you really enjoy, that you're ready to send to a publisher?
Well, I think that most poets would agree with me that the poem is never finished. It just stops before it, before it gets to the publisher. I think poets are notorious fiddlers with the line length, the structure, words, and so forth. No, at this point, I wouldn't say that I have a set way of editing. Sometimes a poem will come out in a rush, and it will arrive almost complete, and it will need very little editing. Other times, I'll get a line, and then another line will come, and then it's a very slow process to build the poem. So I think also too that's one of the things that attracts me about writing poetry is that it's never the same experience. It's always, they're like little miracles, each one. They're always different.
Yeah. You mentioned that you were a student of Albert Goldbarth. Are there other contemporary poets or even recent poets who have been a great influence or a small influence on you as a poet?
Well, I've been very lucky to work with excellent editors who've all been poets in Canada, because I started my writing career really in Canada. I would have to name those Canadian poets who've helped me. One was Gwendolyn McEwen, and another is Don Coles, who has won the Governor General's Award for his poetry and was one of my editors and teachers at the Banff School for the Arts. Okay. And I would have to credit Don, and I think with shaping who I am as a poet, who I was when I was writing this book, but also as I've continued to evolve my style. I often will go back to his words of wisdom, and that was a great influence on my writing.
Have you noticed any major themes or a recurring theme that happens in some of your poetry, or are you drawn to the same subject matter, or do you tend to go clear across the spectrum?
I wasn't consciously aware of it, but I've been told that I have a preoccupation with fire images. And with hot and with cold. Fire Never Sleeps. And I did pull out another poem that might be of interest.
Good.
One of my real obsessions as a writer has been the work of Sylvia Plath, not so much her poetry, although I love the imagery and the poetry, but I studied the journals and the letters, and actually Fire Never Sleeps is part of the Sylvia Plath archives now because of a series of poems that I wrote that were based on her letters and journals, and this is one which began from a line from the journals, and it's titled Flames. Flames hit the trees, their water-induced reflection, dropping floating cinders. It's been a wet summer, and as the pond glitters, your hand brushes mine, touching me in a way that says, close your book, come to me. We suffocate within a white covering of heat, and still cool smoke beats the branches, jiggles in its see-through silk, pulls sensuously down the trunk my back is leaned against. Your kiss encompasses it all. For several minutes I can't breathe, a flush of resistance staining my face. My body has turned rigid at the thought of growing old in this position. Though you collapse your knees, question whether or not I could live without you. What can't be answered inhabits us, our ineffectual words like stray leaves after autumn, those dream embers twisting, plunging.
I like that line, what can't be answered inhabits us. I know that your poetry is also going to be featured in a new anthology called What We Have Lost, or what?
That was published actually.
It's already been published.
In April of last year. What Have You Lost?
What Have You Lost?
Wonderful selection by Naomi Shihab-Nye, and it's geared toward the young adult reader. And there's 140 poets in the anthology. There's one poem each, some very well known, some not as well known. And in effect, all of these poems answer that question, what have you lost? Okay. So I had some work in that book.
It'd be of interest to me, and I think to other readers in the U.S., how does one get copies of your book and these anthologies published in Canada? Are they available at bookstores in the U.S., say Barnes & Noble and Borders and those places, or do they have to be ordered through Canadian publishers? How would one get some of your books?
You can order through Barnes & Noble. There's Amazon.com. Both of my books, collections, The Invisible Moon and Fire Never Sleeps, are still in print. Great. And you can also order through local bookstores, and there's general distributing. Great. So I know here that at the bookmark it wasn't difficult to order the books in. It's very much the same thing as if when I order books from the U.S.
Okay. Do you consider yourself a Canadian poet or an American poet or an American Canadian poet, or how do you characterize, or do you put a label on yourself as a?
Not really.
You're not a regional poet.
No,
Yeah.
I don't think so.
You know, some of your poems, some of your earlier poems are Texas-based, but I wouldn't call you a regional poet.
I like to write about where I'm from. You know, those poems bubble up every once in a while.
Right.
Poems about my grandmother and my uncle, or things that will still tell me where I came from. I think that's very important. All writers need to write about what they know and their background. But because of, I think partly because I have lots of interest in art, in music. I've studied psychology. I've read physics. My father was a physicist, and he did contract work for NASA. He was also a self-taught guitar player. We had lots of interest in our family, so I think the subject matter for the poetry
You're
is
really
wide.
a Renaissance woman. One of the things that I'm always interested in when talking to writers is I know this is kind of a trite question, but it always comes up. What would you tell a person who is just beginning, a person who wants to become a writer, who's interested in being a writer? What kind of advice would you give to someone who thinks he or she would like to be a writer?
I think it's just to show up at the page on a regular basis, not to be afraid to put down whatever you think, not to let, we all have this sort of negative voice or this censor that will sometimes start to speak to us as we're writing, because writing is a very powerful medium. It's very personal. It's what's inside of us, and all sorts of emotions can come out when you're writing. You know, fear, anger. Sometimes I do some of my best writing when I'm really angry about something. And I've been told in leading workshops from students that that's when they say, when they're upset or depressed or angry, that's when it really comes out, what's true and what's inside of you. And I think the other thing is just to observe, to have a quiet place in yourself and sit back and just watch what's going on around you. And I find that's what people are most interested in, that when you write about things, are the details and how to make those details unique in your own voice and from yourself.
How do you feel about what you're going to be doing in the future? You're a well-established poet and classical pianist, and you also, I hadn't asked you about your watercolor, your art.
That's a hobby, actually.
Okay. What do you see the next 3 or 4 or 5 years coming along for you? Where are you going to concentrate your creative or artistic efforts?
Well, recently I've begun to do songwriting. I'm putting my words finally and music together, and I'm in the middle of recording a demo, a 4-track demo with Geoharmonic Records, and the lyrics are based on some of my poems. Some of the lyrics from the songs have just been written just for the music itself. And I'm singing and performing my poetry now, and it's so exciting because I finally feel like I can join the two arts disciplines together. For so long this has been, the music was here and the writing was here, and never the twain shall meet. So this has all come together, and it's a very, very exciting project for me.
Will people be able to get a CD or purchase some of your?
Absolutely.
And you mentioned the publisher or the recording studio. Will that be where they would, how would they go about getting?
Well, there's a website. It's geoharmonic.com, where you can order the CD. It will be out in July, and it's called River Called the Night, which is the title song. And the web is a great thing,
Okay.
isn't it? You can sell anything and have
Yeah.
access to just about anything.
Okay. How do you feel about the way poets are treated in Canada as opposed to the way poets are treated in the U.S.? Is there a difference? I know that Canadian poets, there seems to be more government support for the arts in Canada. Maybe there's not as much.
I don't know.
I know the NEH and the NEA in the U.S., there are millions of dollars that go for different kinds of creative arts. But I guess I had the impression that there was quite a bit of support for the arts in the schools and publishing and such things as that in Canada. Is there really a difference, or is it about the same?
Without having lived here for a number of years, I don't know if I could comment on how much as opposed to what's happening in Canada. I know that during the 90s there was quite a number of government funding cutbacks for artists, and now that the budget is more under, the national budget's more under control, they're starting to feed that money back into the schools and into artist program. Administrative budgets have been cut to allow the artists to have more access to funds. I've been the recipient. I went to, well, for instance, I went to the Banff Center on a special program, completely
That's out in the
funded.
Canadian Rockies? Out there. Right.
Beautiful area to dream and to write, and
so is there
that was
any
good.
Is there any parting advice or some kind of comment that you would like to make, since we're running out of time today? Any other questions I forgot to ask you, or anything else you'd like to say about your poetry or your music? Where do you seem to, what's the strongest impulse now at this point? Poetry or music or both? Or?
Well, I thought for many years that I wouldn't be able to do both arts disciplines successfully, and I've proved that wrong. And I think there are more and more people like me that are interdisciplinary artists. So if you're out there and you're doing 2 things or 3 things, and you think that that's not normal, or it's not something that that you can actually be successful at, you can. I find for myself that the music feeds the writing, and vice versa, that I wasn't able to do just one thing.
Okay, well, Carla Hartsfield, thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
Appreciate
it's been a pleasure.
Okay, and thank you very much for joining us.